When you see Artemis today being described as a return to the moon, what does that phrase mean to you as an astronaut? What are the real constraints that people tend to underestimate when it comes to technology? What is the genuinely new about Artemis? If we removed humans from the equation, the space exploration seems to become much simpler. What would you say counts as success and as failure? My guest today is Dumitru-Dorin Prunariu, astronaut, aerospace engineer, and one of the very few people who have seen Earth from orbit firsthand. Dorin Prunariu, before we look forward, I would like to look back briefly. You flew to space during a very different era. When you see Artemis today being described as a return to the moon, what does that phrase mean to you as an astronaut today?
Actually, I flew into space in a period when we look for flags put on the moon, put around the Earth. Every nation wanted to have an astronaut, a cosmonaut on board the space station to mark the presence of that nation into the outer space. Apollo was the same kind of flight, the same kind of program. During Apollo era, each mission, Apollo mission, was a unique event, was not quite a continuity of something studied a long time and so on. During Apollo era, the Americans wanted to be first to put the flag on the moon, first to touch the moon, and to mark this event at the international level, at a global level. Of course, it was a success. But now, at this time, we don't look for flags on other planets. We look for continuity. We look for much more technology. How do you use this technology? How we approach the space flight from a completely other point of view. Sustainability is the key word here. And sustainability doesn't mean individual episodes. Sustainability means continuity in planning a mission, in technology, in living on another planet or another celestial body like the moon. And this is the most important thing now. The moon was never left by specialists from technical point of view. A lot of missions, automatical missions, were sent to the moon, study the moon, send information about the moon and from the moon. But the pause between Apollo program and Artemis program was a political pause. Because the specialists continue to do things and to develop technologies for reaching the moon at a different level. Artemis means returning to the moon with experience, not with nostalgia. Experience means that during the last 25 years, we reach quite a wide experience flying around the Earth on low Earth orbit, flying on the International Space Station. A lot of experiments, a lot of studies connected with the human body were done on board the space station. The space flights cause a lot of problems, medical problems to the astronauts, a lot of modification in the human body. And we have to learn how to adapt to the new environment, to the space environment, how to make the human body to resist and to stand to all these provocations, medical provocations, during a long space flight. Now, the space flights on board the space stations at a regular base take about 6 months. So we learn how to live and how to adapt the human body to a long space flight. Even there are some records, more than 1 year spent on board the space station. It was done in 94, 95 on board the Mir space station. Russian cosmonauts stayed there 438 days, the time that could take a flight from the Earth to Mars and back. It's a long flight. All these things were done in cooperation now, because space without cooperations can't represent a goal in itself. Of course, competition exists anywhere. In the military field, I don't say about it, the competition is the highest level and so on, but in the civilian space, look, the cooperation for exploring the possibilities of the International Space Station, it's at the greatest level. The Russians, Americans, Japanese, Canadians, Europeans, they fly together. They are good friends. They understand each other on board the space station, and they do things together. So this is how do we see now the sustainability and the continuity of approaching the outer space. Of course, if we look back, this new flight, Artemis 2, which will represent the first return of man around the moon, man and woman, because this is the first time crew formed by a woman and also a colored person will fly around the moon. And of course, they will study the behavior of the human body. They will study how the spacecraft, the Orion spacecraft, faces a 10-day space flight around the moon and returning the crew to the Earth. The same thing was done with within the Apollo missions. Apollo 8 was the first space flight with people on board that reached the moon orbit. They turn around the moon, they study how the human body behave, how the technology behave, and return to the Earth. Apollo 9 studied the landing module only around the Earth, how they undocked and docked in the space, and how they could return to the Earth from the moon, but they study all these things around the Earth. Apollo 10 was very close to touch the moon, but their mission was to study in detail all phases of the human flight to the moon. And only Apollo 11, when 20 of July, touched the moon, and the first person from the Earth, Neil Armstrong and then Buzz Aldrin, they step on the moon. Now Artemis 2 study the behavior of the human body and of the new technology, completely new technology, flying around the moon and returning to Earth. Artemis 3 will be a success. We hope to be a big success, because Artemis 3 is planned to touch the moon, and the crew, a human crew, will step on the moon, on the South Pole. It's a completely different environment. It's a completely different place, comparing with the astronauts of the Apollo program. They landed around the equator, in different other places, but not on the poles of the moon. The South Pole represents now a big target for all humanity, not only for Americans, for Chinese, for any other who will send technology and people on the moon. Because the South Pole represents a place with many resources that could be used by humanity. I say by humanity because we'll develop infrastructure on the moon. If the Apollo program was planned to just investigate the moon and to return the people and the spacecraft to Earth, Artemis mission, it's a program, a long program that will build infrastructure on moon. Infrastructure that will allow sustainable continuation of the flights and of the exploration, exploitation, and use of the moon at this time.
So they will leave cargo on the moon?
Or they will leave cargo. Of course, in time they will be bases for humans to live on the moon. The moon environment, it's of course not favorable to life. There is no atmosphere, first. Besides that, the space radiation is much higher on the moon than around the Earth and on the Earth. living on the moon in a completely closed environment for long periods of time will cause, of course, some problems and put some challenges in front of the humanity. Development of new technologies, development of space medicine, all these things will help to build the infrastructure and to live on the moon and to work on the moon. But of course, all these things will give us a huge experience in approaching another celestial body, Mars. The main target of humanity is not only the moon. The moon, it's an experience, is to learn how to live, how to work on another celestial body, but the big target is Mars. Mars, which is a planet, it's like the Earth. It's, I could say, a terrestrial body, if we could say. It has atmosphere, it has seasons. The structure of Mars, it's pretty close to the structure of the Earth. It looks that on Mars it existed a long time ago, millions of years ago, water and maybe life. We study now the possibility of discovering some ancestral traces of life on Mars. But all these things will be learned by humanity, having quite wide experience on working on a moon. Moon is much closer to Earth. From Earth to the moon, it takes about 4 days of flight. And back the same thing. From Mars, it's 8 months maybe. It's much farther. And
at the moment, I would say.
At the moment,
yeah.
at the moment, but this is the law of physics.
Yeah.
You can't change the physics.
But
of course,
we talk about new technologies in view, like the warp.
New engines, plasma engines, and so all that work longer time, accelerates to a much higher speed, and then decelerate, and could limit the time of flying to Mars and back at 2 months maybe.
Yeah.
But this is something to be studied.
We're not there yet. But you mentioned, Dorin, you mentioned technology, and I think this is a key word I would like to look at the moment. Because from the outside, it often feels like space technology should be moving faster than it is actually. Yeah, but from the inside, what are the real constraints that people tend to underestimate when it comes to technology?
Yeah, of course. As you see, the technology is developing very fast. To fly into the outer space, you have to use approved technology. These technologies should be tested in many flights to be sure that it works for years. It will allow to continue the space flight, not just to have an experiment, a very bright experiment, to come back to the Earth, and you don't know if next time you could repeat it in the same conditions with the same results. So the technology develops. You see now the artificial intelligence, we have robots on board the space station, but we test all these things for years. This technology should be proved to be sure and to ensure a sustainability and the continuity of the space flights. It takes years. It takes years. This is the reason just the very fast development of technology doesn't mean that we can instantly fly into space for a longer time and using in very good conditions all these technologies. When we return now to space, we return with experience. Experience gain on board the International Space Station, experience gain representing the different conditions of the human body, experience gain in using different type of technology for years and years in the outer space, in the weightlessness, in an environment with a kind of radiation, in the vacuum outside the International Space Station. But now we prove what type of technology could be used with success on the moon.
So we have two major factors here. We have the technological part, but also we have the human part, the biological part. So where does the human biology become the limit factor?
Of course, the biology could be a limit. the human body stands to different provocations, but not to all of them into the outer space. By instance, the isolation for a long time into the outer space could cause different problems, even psychological problems. The social behavior of an astronaut could be different in a very small environment with a very few people around than on a society on the ground. Some medical problems should be solved into the outer space. Now, not long ago, a crew from the International Space Station, the Crew 11, should land because of a medical problem that could be solved on board the space station of one of the members of the crew. And they have to return before the term. They have to return earlier than it was planned. If such things happen into the outer space much farther than on Earth, you can't solve them on the ground. You have to solve them in place. You have to test a lot of procedures, medical procedures, to solve the problems, including in the future surgery into the outer space. Of course, there are different conditions. In weightlessness, a lot of things behave different than on the ground. This is the reason you have to test all these things on board the space station for now and use them in the future on the Moon or on Mars. We lay also on cooperation, on the mutual understanding between nations. Each of them, they develop different experiments, different technologies, and they use them together on board the space station, and they will use them together on Mars. You know, Artemis program now has more than 50 states approve and signing the Artemis Accords. So they were 54 last time, they will be more. All these nations agree to take part in the moon exploration in a way or in another way. With theoretical studies, with small experiments, with probes sent to the moon, or taking part in the Artemis program itself. By instance, the European Space Agency, as you know, and as everybody knows, with respect to the moon, built the service module of the Orion spacecraft. The service module is built entirely by Europe. Also will take part in the construction of the Getaway space station, Moon space station.
Are we still talking about the Getaway?
Yeah, we still talk about Getaway. You know, with the new administration, there were different opinions and different, let's say, orders given to NASA, even to stop the scientific program or to limit the scientific program. But not all the things were approved by the Congress. The Congress approved to not limit the budget for science, by instance, and to continue the exploration of the interplanetary space, of the asteroids, comets, other planets, and so on. Because here, the United States were in forefront of the research. Why to stop them and to let others to compete and to have much better results if you already reach a very high level? Also with the Artemis program, the Getaway station was included in the program, and the final decision was to continue to build the space station because it offers a lot of new opportunities for humanity. Of course, using the new not yet approved for the moon flights Starship ships of SpaceX that could send crews directly to the moon, not only around the moon on orbit like Orion does. You have to build another lander to bring the astronauts from Orion and put them on the moon and bring them back to fly back with Orion to the Earth. For now, NASA has agreements with SpaceX and with Blue Origin as well that build landing modules to bring astronauts. But the new spaceship, the Starship built by Elon Musk, will bring astronauts directly to the moon and will bring them back to Earth. And crews much bigger than Orion does. Orion has 4 seats. Starship could have 10 seats or even more, and to bring much more and more efficient astronauts to the moon. Maybe in the future, if there will be an agreement between public and private entities to use this spaceship much cheaper and more efficient, Of course, the Artemis program will continue with this kind of technology. But till then, the program continues as it was scheduled from the beginning, including building a space station, a moon space station.
Because, you know, Artemis is often presented as a new beginning. Well, from your perspective, what is the genuinely new about Artemis, and what remains fundamentally the same as the Apollo mission?
The same as during the Apollo mission, there are challenges for the humans, challenges for the human body, for the astronauts. They are the same. Human body behaves the same way, so the
Radiation.
space conditions influence in the same way the human body. What is new is the continuity. It's building a spacecraft, building a technology that will ensure a long time exploration of the moon. Not only a specific point to be explored, coming back, unique space flight, but a space flight with continuity and sustainability. Cooperation, international cooperation, it's also very important in the Artemis program. Apollo was done only by Americans, was a purely American program. Artemis, it's an international program. Many friends of the United States, many friends of the new technology, Western Europe, Japan, they, of course, take part in the Artemis program. I could say that the legal framework for Artemis program, it's much wider and more international than everything that was done in the Apollo program.
You mentioned several times, and we discussed, I'm challenging you on the biology part of this thing. If we removed humans from the equation, the space exploration seems to become much simpler. So why do we keep insisting on human spaceflight? And what price does that decision carry?
Yes, if we use only robots, the spaceflight is much simpler. The technology is simpler. Even the failure is not fail like when humans fail to fly into space, or look what happened with the Space Shuttle Challenger and Columbia. Big catastrophes into the outer space with big resonance in the humanity. Robots are efficient but incomplete. Why? Because humans provide, in the framework of a space flight, some contextual judgment and meaning. You can determine by yourself, using your mind, a lot of things, and you can adapt things, program, actions in place. The robots, of course, using now the artificial intelligence, could do much more than they did before. But in the same time, human spaceflight has a deep symbolic value. For humans, flying to the outer space means progress of the mind, means openness to the new discoveries. If you send just robots, you stay at home, you control the robots from your room with a joystick, and that's all. The limitation of the humans, it's right here around you. Of course, real costs, the risk, the complexity, the time, the moral responsibility for a human spaceflight, they are much higher. But we have to fly. We have to dare. We have to show humanity that we can project ourselves into the outer space and into the solar system. For now, into the solar system. Maybe in hundreds of years from now, outside the solar system and to fly to other galaxies, but this is a completely different thing. So even if robots, they are cheaper, they do a lot of things. So they don't do the contextual judgment, and they don't appreciate the meaning of what they discover and of the spaceflight itself. This is the difference between the robots and the human spaceflight.
I know you mentioned earlier about sustainable human presence, but in your experience, because Apollo was about proving, as you said, capability, and Artemis claims to be about sustainability. What does, in your experience, does sustainable human presence actually mean?
Sustainable human presence into the outer space and on the moon, because we speak about the moon during the next years, the moon will be the main target of the space flights, means first continuity, a long time exploration. Means programs that will not change with political changes on the ground. Means a program approved and an international cooperation developed such way that they are not affected by different changes in the society on the ground, by different conflicts on the ground. Look, even if there are conflicts on the ground now, even if the war in Ukraine is still there, the Russians and the Americans cooperate on board the International Space Station from a long time. They are more than 25 years. They fly together and they understand together and they understand the meaning, what means the space flight, comparing with the human problems on the ground. When you fly up there into the outer space, there are no borders. You see the planet as a unique entity. It's a unique home of all humanity. All things happening here, borders, quarrels, wars, and so on, they don't have much importance from the perspective of a space flight, of the understanding of the importance of a space flight. Space flight means all humanity. Space flight, yeah.
Well, that leads me to my next question, actually, Doreen, because you've seen Earth from space, and it's something that very few humans actually can have ever experienced. So you are in a privileged position to speak from first hand from the perspective of somebody who has seen Earth from the space, and I would like you to to dig further into this, how your perspective changes as a human being in the way that you think about space exploration and humanity's future. And I would like to add something to it. I said space exploration, not space colonization.
Yes, right. First, if we take the international agreements, space can't become the property of anybody, nation, entity, private, public, and so on. So no parts of the moon or Mars could become a property of somebody. But it's an international space and you go there to explore, to exploit, to use it, but not to take the ownership of this body. So from my point of view, Earth from space reveals a big fragility. As I said, border vanished, interdependence dominates into the outer space. Space is not an escape from Earth. Explorations becomes in space an ethical responsibility. When we speak about ethics, it's something completely different than when you just go once, put the flag, dig, come back, and you're a hero. Of course, we'll have many heroes from now, but the permanence, the protection of the Earth, understanding the vulnerability of the Earth in working in the outer space, it's very much important. It's much more important than before or than when we explore now possibilities around the Earth. Cooperation, it's not it's a necessity. It's not just an idealism. Because, as I said, in the first time when we explored space, during my time in 81, when I flew into space, everything was national. Everything was cooperation was between very few parties that took part in a specific program. Now international cooperation, it's very important. And Earth's future and space exploration became inseparable. So we see the space, we see the Earth from the outer space as a collective endeavor. we astronauts. And of course, as I said in the beginning, we see the vulnerability of the Earth, and we understand in a completely different way the necessity to protect, to work and live in peace, and to not damage anything on the ground, because we have to keep it for the next generations, not only for us.
Changes, isn't it, how you think about borders, about uh, collaboration, as you said, but also about conflict. It gives us an idea that, you know, we don't have another Earth at the moment.
That's right. That's right. And any major conflict affect not only the Earth, affect the humanity, affect our future. And we really have to understand all these things, even if there are a lot of conflicts, even if the military industrial complex should prove that they do the highest technology to use it anywhere in the world, if it's possible, we have to understand in the same time that we have to protect the planet, protect the humanity. Of course, if we speak about risks and responsibilities, risk into the outer space, it's unavoidable, but it's manageable. Risk acceptance means honesty. You know that when you are trained for the outer space, you could face a lot of risks into the outer space. But in the same time, you are trained to face this risk, to manage the risk, and to live with the risks. Of course, a lot of people say, it's risky, why don't go there? Of course, they stay on the Earth. But there are people that could manage the risk, take the responsibility, and fly into the outer space. In this case, the decisions concerning the technology used, the risk faced into the outer space should be a collective one. Not only the engineers should speak about the risks, also the politicians should understand the risks and why they send people to the outer space and what is the achievement of space flight, of testing new technology, of exploring outer space, comparing with the risk. Of course, as I said before, we've seen what means a risk that could lead to catastrophes. Not only the Americans, the Russians had also catastrophes into the outer space. The risk is high, but it's manageable.
So when is the risk acceptable then? So when the society you mentioned can decide, well, this risk is acceptable.
You know, you have to educate the society that we have to live with risks. There are a lot of risks on the ground. Risk of natural catastrophes, risk of using not completely tested technology, risk of using proof technology but in an environment that is not completely understandable. There are a lot of risks on Earth, but also the risk on the outer space. You have to educate the society that these risks exist anyhow, and you can manage the risk till a certain level. But this level should be high enough to be accepted by the society, by the people building technology into the outer space, and by the politicians as well, because they decide in the end what program it's accepted, what program is financed, and why, and what are the advantages of flying into space with a certain level of risks.
Mm. Dorin, if we look 20, 30 years ahead in the future, what would meaningful progress in human spaceflight actually look like? Well, beyond the flags and the headlines we mentioned earlier.
First, the success reached during all these years, from 30 years before and in the future also for the next decades, everything should represent a continuity, not isolated moments. And of course, repeated presence beyond the low Earth orbit should continue on a permanent base. Long-term cruise health, it's a big problem. We have to manage the health of the astronauts. If we made a lot of tests around the Earth, a lot of experiments, we have to manage for a much longer time the human body and all the problems caused by the outer space on the human body. Of course, the performance of humans, it's higher and higher with more and more protection, with more and more medical technologies and medical improvements that we learn about them. When I flew into the outer space, I didn't too much about the importance of the space radiation. I didn't know about the eye and the problems caused by the outer space to the human eye. And they were discovered a lot of things connected with this new functioning of the human organs, and a lot of things were improved, adapted to protect them. So the crew health and performance will be an important target for the next 20, 30 years of the space flight. Also, the functional cooperation of the states in using the outer space, it's also something that should be improved and should continue on the long, long term. Big nations have quite important technologies, but they have to prove that they could explore in cooperation, in mutual understanding the outer space. Now, let's see about the moon. The Chinese are ready to send people to the moon. They, in the last articles, international articles, I found the information that in 2028, 2029, they'll also put a person on the moon in the region of the South Pole. The region of the South Pole is targeted by many other nations, including the Artemis program. What they will do on the moon? Will fight for different places, will compete. If something happens, a catastrophe on the moon, they will cooperate or not, and so on. All these things should be approached now, should be solved now, and the change of information, cooperation should be developed. In this aspect, I could tell you that in 2024, I proposed on behalf of Romania, of my nation, the organization at the level of the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space of a special action team on lunar activities cooperation. ATLAC, it's the name of this action team. I had a vision. I had some information about the space flights around the moon. In the end of 2023 and beginning of 2024, there were many probes around the moon on quite the same orbit, probes sent by the United States, by India, by Japan, by South Korea, and two of them, they were very close to collide because there was not a change of information between nations, between the stakeholders sending these probes around the moon. It was quite a competition. But these things, so the South Korean one had to maneuver to avoid a collision with other ones. It gave me the idea that a mechanism at the level of the United Nations should exist for sharing information and for cooperation. And I proposed this ATLAC. I convinced the nations. They all approved these things. They said, yes, it's necessary. And in the summer, in June 2024, during the session of COPUOS, of this Committee on the Peaceful Use of Outer Space, this structure was approved. And the main reason of the functioning of this structure is first to offer a platform for sharing information and cooperation in avoiding conflicts on the moon, avoiding interferences, determine how to share the responsibilities on the moon, how to protect the moon, how to make the moon flights sustainable, and at the same time to determine what type of mechanism, of a permanent mechanism at the level of UN should be created to favorize this cooperation at the long, long time. Try to understand that interoperability is also a problem on the moon. If some nations have a failure and another nation is very close, they have to have, for saving, for rescue the crews, for rescue humans on the moon, quite same type of interoperable devices, environments, and so on, just to offer the possibility to each other to cooperate and to save to save them on the moon. Competition is one thing, but responsibility for using humans on the moon, it's a little bit different thing. So this is the way we see the next 20, 30 years. Of course, the next 20 or 30 years represent a credible path for the next generation. We have to prepare the new generation of specialists, of technicians, of researchers, and of the astronauts to explore the space in the next decades in the new environment characterized by new technologies, cooperation, and continuity. True progress in such conditions could be durable. And of course, the routine presence, it's a keyword that we could use for the next 20, 30 years. Crew health, in the same time, interoperability, as I said, education also, and quiet progress, not outsending media, sparks, and so on, but continuity and new reach of research, understanding, and cooperation.
Advancing step by step,
by
not
step.
Jumping over or
Yes,
trying to
with continuity,
achieve
yes.
something spectacular for the sake of getting famous, which makes me think about, from this perspective, what would you say counts as success and as failure? Is there anything in particular that would count? How would we define success and failure?
Yes, it's interesting question. I would define success in reaching new heights into the outer space at a continuous level with cooperation, sustainability, education, something that could be rich and could be useful for all humanity, not only for a specific nation, for a specific group of interest. Failure just sparks into the outer space, failure of technology, using a bright new not tested technology could bring the failure and then delay a long time the new successes into the outer space. The lack of cooperation, conflicts on the ground caused by lack of cooperation and understanding, this is a failure.
I think this defines really well what we should think about it. How do we bring together private sector with governments at the same table to decide what should be done and what should not be done?
Always the private sector, it's involved in the new space programs. It's involved in the moon exploration, exploitation, and use. It's involved in the low Earth orbit flights. I think the private sector and the governments and many other entities should work together, should define together the new steps of development in the space field. It's obvious that a private entity like SpaceX, it's more efficient than the governments in using the new rockets, the recoverable rockets, using a new technology into the outer space. The price drops when you use privates because they manage in a different way the spending for the outer space and the efficiency of their products. Of course, the governments, they are indispensable in the space exploration because sometimes they define the new levels of exploration and borders of new technologies. In the beginning, the private entities, they don't invest in something that not have result in profit.
Yeah.
Yes, of course, very profitable became the SpaceX because the SpaceX now the outstanding private entity that fly into space, work together with NASA, send satellites, internet networks, and so on. They have profit because they are more efficient than the governments. They use a technology that costs less, and as long as they are cheaper, a lot of private entities come to them and government entities also to launch into space probes, experiments, satellites, and so on. It's for profit. In the same time, the exploration of the moon could bring a profit for the private entities. NASA develops now or already signed agreements with 14 private entities to provide services on the moon. It's cheaper for the government, it's more efficient for private entities to have money from NASA to develop their own technologies to help the Artemis program. So in the future, it's an indispensable connection between private entities, governments, and many other stakeholders.
So keeping everybody interested,
yes,
into the
keeping everybody interested and cooperating,
and make it profitable for everyone.
Yes, and developing together
yeah.
new levels of technology and space flights.
Durin Prunariu, thank you for helping to see human space flights not as a spectacle, but as a long and complex human project. As Artemis prepares to launch on the 6th of February, conversations like this remind us that going to space is not just about rockets, is also about patience, responsibility, and a long team thinking. Thank you for watching Highway to Space. Remain curious about the cosmos and keep looking up.
Hey, space dreamers, this is Dan Profeer, broadcasting live from Highway to Space. Strapping tight, we're ready to ignite on a journey through the cosmos. Stars shining bright from the earth below to the skies above. Highway to space, where we dream and love. Astronauts and dreamers, together we'll soar, exploring the universe, always wanting more with a passion that fuels us light years away. Join the adventure, let's seize the day. Highway to space, come and join the ride with stories untold. Let your dreams be your guide. Futures unfolding in the depths of the night. Highway to space, let your spirit take flight. Let your spirit take flight. Crash, echoing the voices of stars, science and art. We're breaking down bars from Mars to the asteroids. We'll never be still, unraveling mysteries fueled by the thrill. With scientists, artists, and thinkers galore, dreaming tomorrow. There's so much in store. Every episode, we're charting new ground together, exploring our passion about. Highway to space, come and join the ride with stories untold. Let your dreams be your guide. Futures unfolding in the depths of the night. Highway to space, let your spirit take flight. Let your spirit take flight. Galaxies go with wonder so vast. The future is bright. Our dreams hold fast. Together we'll reach for the stars and beyond. Join the revolution of which we're so fond. It's too late to wait. It's time to awake on this high.